Hello, it's Aaron here at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum in a pretty chilly East Lothian. And it's time for the 9th video update of our What If 2 campaign. Now, I know it's only a few days since video number 8, but as promised, things have been moving pretty quickly, and I didn't want to leave it any longer before updating you on what's been taking place. So let's explore what's been happening between the 19th and the 22nd of November. Starting just with a wider strategic look at where we left it at the end of the last video, you can see the Jacobite forces. A force has appeared in front of Argyll near Fort William. Charles Edward's force has taken Fort Augustus. We know that Lord Lewis Gordon is now Jacobite governor of Stirling Castle. And Lord Ogilvy's Jacobite regiment has appeared in Dundee. Now, once it was clear that the Jacobite forces had indeed moved into the Highlands, Marshal Wade felt confident enough to move back onto the offensive. And so, as I've shown you here, he's moved up and laid siege to Stirling Castle. In fact, Wade offers pretty generous terms to Lord Lewis Gordon, who rejects them, presumably because he's under orders to delay that army for as long as he can to give the Prince a free hand in the Great Glen. Now, I should also add at this point that Marshal Wade has been, in a very tactful way, removed from his command on the front lines. It's been decided his experience would be much more valuable in preparing for a defence line in England, and he's been succeeded by Henry Hawley. Hawley just hasn't quite arrived yet. Now, if we go back up into the Highlands, I know you'll remember this because it's only a few days away, but Charles Edward Stuart suddenly appeared in front of Fort Augustus and with a very bold but very successful attack managed to storm and seize it. Now, he didn't know that just the day before he attacked Fort Augustus, 2/3 of the available strength of the garrison had marched out, Norman MacLeod's Highland Independent Companies, on the way south to Fort William. As I mentioned in the last video, MacLeod's men were ordered by Argyll to blow the bridge at High Bridge in their wake as they moved down towards reinforcing him. They had plenty of time to do it because of delays for Lord George Murray's Jacobite units in getting their guns up to position in Fort William. And in fact, Argyll was considering whether he might be able to use MacLeod's as a sort of surprise sally against any Jacobite batteries. So he gave orders to MacLeod only to arrive after nightfall on the 20th of November. These apparently insignificant actions of MacLeod's regiment were actually really quite important, because when Charles Edward did move his divisions down towards Fort William, they found the road was impassable at High Bridge. That meant that he had to spend the rest of the day trying to find alternative crossings, and since the most viable one is here, then trying to find enough boats to start bringing his heavier guns across the water. So the earliest that Charles Edward could get any troops across to Fort William would be late in the afternoon of the 21st of November. Let's have a closer look at Fort William then. You can see the fort in the centre here, slightly irregular shape because it's forced onto an outcrop between the river and the loch to give it protection on two sides. There's a village just to the right there, that's Maryborough. William and Mary, of course, therefore dating the fort for us to the end of the 17th century. And here it is on the tabletop. The crucial difference to Fort Augustus is that there is this forward ravelin in front of the gate, protecting the gate from the sort of direct fire that had been problematic at Fort Augustus. It is still overlooked by high ground, but not to the same extent as Fort Augustus. And of course, there is still water protecting two sides. And because Loch Lynn is open to the sea, naval ships Baltimore and Serpent have been able to come up in support. The garrison did attempt to fire some of the buildings in Maryborough, which you can see just to the right of the picture there, to deny shelter to the rebels, although they'd be foolhardy to come down that way because they'd be under the fire of the naval vessels as well as the fort. So our Highlanders are forced to stay on the high ground. You can see there Lord George Murray in the centre with 2 battalions, his own Athol Brigade. There's the small battalion of Clancameron, that's what's left of them after the bloody rout they suffered at Bannockburn, and the Stuarts of Appin in front of them. Just out of picture are the McLaughlins, who've joined the operation as it's progressed. Jacobites also have some batteries of light guns and both mortars that are royal and cohorns, 2 different sizes, 2 different ranges. So, as I say, the Jacobites arrive late on the 19th. They begin on the morning of the 20th of November to scout out positions from which they might be able to erect batteries to threaten and damage the fort. Historically, the Jacobites did lay siege to Fort William, but not until March 1746, so we're ahead of the historical timeline in effect. But I've used this convenient map of the Jacobite siege of 1746 as the background for us to understand what's happening in our campaign, because the Jacobites have put their batteries in more or less the same positions. The Jacobites' main guns, the light guns, are on Cow Hill here, and the mortars are concentrated over at Sugarloaf Hill, but only the royal mortars are within range of the fort. If the cohorns want to open fire, they're going to have to look for a position such as this one here in the burial ground, closer to the fort itself. Looking at the Jacobite infantry then, the 2 Athol battalions, then the Camerons and the Stuarts, and then the McLaughlins, looking a little lonesome on the Jacobite right. So the Jacobites spend most of the 20th moving their guns up into these positions and choosing their location for the batteries. You can see them here as day turns into evening, overlooking Fort William. What Lord George Murray does not know, though, is that Argyle is here. He does not know that Argyle has been reinforced by the Paisley militia. Nevertheless, it is clear that Fort William is going to be a tough nut to crack. Surely it can be assumed that the Jacobites will just dig in, wait for reinforcements now to come from Fort Augustus, and so Argyle can keep plotting whether it might be possible to launch a sally in communication with MacLeod, perhaps against that mortars and McLaughlins on the vulnerable Jacobite right. And then, suddenly, without digging in, the Jacobite guns open fire at extreme range, having moved forward as soon as it became dark enough to mask their movements. And it seems the Jacobites are in a bit of a hurry. Our Jacobite team specifically required a nighttime assault on the evening of the 20th, and here they go, their guns and royals opening fire on the fort. In order to reflect the confusion and difficulty of a night attack, we do have some special rules that apply on the tabletop, one of which is much reduced visibility, and of course, once a unit has started firing, its position becomes much more visible. So the Jacobites were able to move their guns forwards into range without being detected, but as soon as they start firing on the fort, HMS Baltimore is able to unleash a broadside in response, and the heavy mortars on HMS Serpent are able to lob their bombs towards the flashing muzzles of the Jacobite batteries, as do the mortars and the cannons of the fort itself. The Jacobites waste no time. In what must have been a terrifying landscape, illuminated by the thunder and flash of the guns, the Jacobite assault parties move forward. The Athol Brigade moving towards one bastion here, the Camerons and the Stuarts moving towards the curtain wall in the centre, and the McLaughlins moving towards the other bastion, whilst the mortars, the cohorns behind, move towards the burial ground in an attempt to support the McLaughlins. In this, the mortars are successful. They get up into position in the burial ground, but the McLaughlins are disordered by the fire from the bastions. Elsewhere, though, the Athol Brigade, the Appins and the Camerons rush towards the walls. They also rush into a storm of canister, musketry and mortar bombs. The Jacobite casualties as they approach Fort William are pretty ghastly. In fact, the Stuarts of Appin, as you can see here, they've been disordered, and it's left to the smaller battalion of Clancameron to rush through and get their ladders up against the walls. Here then to give us a bird's eye view of the new dispositions as the Jacobite assaults go in. First here, second here. The McLaughlins stalled here, but the mortars able to fire against the bastion here. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, casualties amongst the Jacobite assault waves are pretty high. The 1st Battalion of the Athol Brigade is broken just as it gets the ladders against the walls. It's the first serious setback and an indication that perhaps this fort is going to be tougher to take than Fort Augustus proved. Nevertheless, the Camerons get their ladders up against the walls and begin to climb, the Paisley militiamen waiting on the walls behind them, firing their muskets down upon them as they come. Ironically, the place where the defenders are taking the worst casualties is the bastion where the McLaughlins have failed to get up against the walls, where they are exposed to the close-range mortar fire of those cohorns in the burial ground. Argyll, who presumably can't believe the Jacobites are launching such a desperate assault, despite the relative numerical parity of the two forces, brings the companies of the Paisley militia that were defending the Ravelin back into the fort. He's divided the Paisley militia into 2 small battalions for the purposes of covering as much ground as possible during the engagement. The Jacobite assault continues to look extremely vulnerable. You can see that as well as the 1st Battalion of the Athol Brigade driven back here, the Appins, who'd been disordered and forced to sit under intense fire in the no man's land between the two armies, they have also been routed. And the Camerons, who'd almost got a foothold, had been driven back, not broken, but pushed back from the walls. But just as it seemed the Jacobite assault must fail, things seemed to turn. The Jacobite batteries scored a remarkable success in disabling the mortar batteries in the Ravelin. And the 2nd Battalion of the Athol Brigade managed to get up onto the walls, routing the Argyll militia and overrunning the guns and mortars in this bastion. The Clan Cameron rushed up in support. Which is just as well, because as half of the Paisley militia came to try and plug the gap, they succeeded in disordering the Athol men who'd got onto the bastion, and it was left to the Camerons to try and exploit the advantage. Over on the other bastion, the McLaughlins have also finally got their ladders up against the walls. The defenders here, battered by 2 mortar batteries, both the cohorns in the burial ground and the royals further back on Sugarloaf Hill, are potentially very vulnerable now to this McLaughlin assault. Here we have a look then at the situation. Jacobite casualties very high, but they're slowly grinding their way forwards into the fort. Of course, in doing so, they're also masking targets from their guns, and so the Jacobite artillery batteries are now starting to become less and less significant. Nevertheless, it is still very bad news for the Jacobites when one of their batteries is destroyed by unopposed fire now from the Royal Navy. A significant loss, a Jacobite artillery battery completely knocked out of action. And then an event for which the Jacobites had not prepared. MacLeod's men come rushing over the bridge on the River Ness and rushing up into the flank and rear of the Jacobite assault. So a rapidly developing situation now, and things still swinging in the balance. MacLeod's coming up and overrunning that Cohorn battery in the burial ground. But the McLaughlins have driven the garrison back from the bastion, and the Camerons and the Athol Brigade are still contesting with the Paisley militia, the other. It still could go either way. In fact, the Camerons succeed in routing the companies of the Paisley militia that are trying to hold the bastion. That means that now everything that remains to Argyll is falling back into the heart of the fort. Just one small battalion of the Paisleys, just one small battalion of regulars. This is now looking pretty desperate. But every Jacobite unit that has fought its way into the fort is shaken, has suffered high casualties, and could be swept from the battlefield and from the campaign by a single good volley. Can the Jacobites push that final distance to secure the fort and force Argyll's surrender? The Camerons are the closest to their enemy, and they surge towards them. And they almost succeed. They don't succeed in breaking the Paisley militia, but they drive them back towards the lockside walls of the fort. But at the same time, the garrison soldiers in the centre there from Guise manage to disorder the MacLaughlans and prevent them from launching a downward charge. All of the Jacobite units are now vulnerable, and at this crucial moment, the MacLeods are able to come up and threaten their rear. At this point, it's still completely uncertain who can win this battle, but on balance, the Jacobite forces are more bloodied. And with the wider needs of the campaign in mind, Murray calls off the attack. He brings his men out of Fort William. He cannot dare to push them forwards one more time, because if these units are broken, they will be very difficult to replace. Sometimes it is better to pull yourself back from the brink and preserve your strength for another day. And so here's our final stage. With MacLeod having driven through the Cohorn battery towards the fort, the Jacobites decide to pull back. The 2nd Battalion of the Athol Brigade gets out. The Clancameron men pull out behind them, and the MacLaughlans come out too. Meanwhile, Argyll has pulled everybody back onto the lochside walls, from which they were in a strong position to inflict devastating fire if the Jacobites attempted to renew the contact. Nevertheless, Argyll has lost about half of his garrison. Buildings burned throughout the course of the night, destroying much-needed shelter and supplies, and he has a difficult decision to make in the morning. In fact, Lord George Murray does offer to negotiate terms. He offers to invite Argyll to withdraw with safe conduct all the way to Fort George at Inverness, as long as he leaves behind his arms. Judging from the piles of Jacobite bodies and wounded, however, Argyll decides these terms are not to be commended. He can withdraw out of Fort William without concern for a Jacobite attack, because he's so weakened the enemy, and because he can withdraw under the guns of the Royal Navy. And this is what he decides to do. And so Argyll makes the best of his situation. He abandons the fort, spiking the remaining guns, and withdraws under cover of the naval guns, whilst Lord George Murray makes absolutely no effort with his badly battered division to intercede. Once Argyll is clear, the remaining fort buildings can be destroyed by the Jacobites. It was a pretty reckless attempt to launch this assault without knowing the strength of the garrison. Perhaps the Jacobites were let down by their intelligence gathering in this instance. Perhaps they were encouraged by the speed with which Fort Augustus had been carried. However, it remains the case that both Fort William and Fort Augustus have now fallen to the prince's men. So as we see, Argyll is now able to move out of the Fort William area and seek a position of safety or support for the main army. I'm not going to give too much away in that. Arrow is purely indicative because operations are still live, of course. Charles Edward and Lord George Murray now control the central and southern areas of the Great Glen. What they will do next, though, remains a mystery to our British team, at least. Will the Jacobites attempt to pursue Argyll and come down to relieve Stirling, or will they turn their attention against Fort George up there at Inverness and secure all of the north in the name of King James? What will our redcoats do? Well, they have started to take notice of the fact that there is a regiment at Dundee, and maybe they will turn their attention in that direction, or maybe they will, now that they know where the main army is, turn their attention northwards. It also has to be remembered that moving up slowly through the centre of England, the Duke of Cumberland is bringing a fresh army brought over from the continent. If the Jacobites want to win this war, they are going to have to defeat not only Wade, but Cumberland as well. So some pretty dramatic events over the past week, and I'm sure dramatic events still to come. I hope you're enjoying the campaign. If you want to get involved, of course, as our British Army's Council of War continues, it's on Facebook. You can see What If 1745 Wargame, the link below me. We hope you are enjoying the campaign. As always, we love to see your comments. We love to hear your feedback. Keep getting in touch, and I'll see you again very soon.